Hey everybody, Jay Winters here again for University Lutheran. We're glad that you could be with us for these 100 Bible stories. Today we're talking about Jesus, but we're not talking about his birth and childhood anymore. We're talking about the beginning of his public ministry. And so that's what we're going to be getting into. You can see that there's a lot of stories in Jesus' public ministry, and we're going to be taking them a little bit out of order, but we're going to be taking them according to sort of three major headings, and that is first of all, public identifiers. These are things that kind of show who Jesus is. Second, miracles of nature. And then last, Jesus and people. And so let's jump into it. We've got a lot of work to get done today. So let's take a look at public identifiers. These are stories that revealed who Jesus was and what his public ministry was all about. So, of course, Jesus is always showing who he is, but these events particularly show us who Jesus is as he starts to reveal himself as the Son of God. So that starts off with his baptism, moves on to his temptation, calling the disciples, and then finally the transfiguration. So, Jesus' baptism, he's baptized by his cousin John in the Jordan River. When Jesus did this, it was a sign that he was becoming the new Israel, because Israel became Israel sort of when they crossed over the Jordan River. And so that's what Jesus is doing. He's becoming the new Israel. And in that, he is allowing us to be baptized as well and to become a part of that Israel also. In this, we also see that God is showing in his baptism that Jesus is his only son. He says that from on high. He says, "This is my son, listen to him." So now we're going to move on into Jesus' temptation, which comes right after his baptism. So directly after he's baptized, the Spirit sends Jesus out into the wilderness. He goes out there and he is fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. And he is then tempted by God's enemy, Satan. In this story, we see that Jesus is actually able to resist Satan, something that you and I are not always able to do. And yet, Jesus still remains sinless even throughout this grueling amount of temptation, something that we as normal humans can't do. So then we get to calling the disciples. So when Jesus calls his disciples, he shows that he has a purpose. Jesus doesn't just come in order to get something done. He doesn't die on the cross just so that our sins can be forgiven, but rather he actually calls us into a community with one another and with him. And so that's kind of what he shows us about himself as he calls the disciples. Then we get into the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration is this great event. It happens a little bit later after the disciples get called. There's several things that happen here, but this is right before Jesus is going to be crucified in Jerusalem. And at that time, Jesus and three of his main disciples, Peter, James, and John, go up to the Mount of Transfiguration, and there he is transfigured before them. He is also seen. God allows Moses and Elijah to be with him there, and shows that this Jesus Christ is really not just a man. He's not just a great teacher, but he is actually God. So, after the public identifiers, we get into the miracles of nature. These are kind of Jesus's biggest miracles that don't involve people, or at least don't involve people directly. So there's water into wine, calming a storm, feeding the 5,000, and then walking on water. And so all of these things show Jesus' true nature is fully God and also fully man. They also a lot of times have a lot of meaning to them. They're not just kind of done as things that Jesus is showing off, but rather he's trying to tell us something about who he is. So we jump into water into wine. So John records this as Jesus' first miracle. Jesus turns 6 large stone jars of water into wine to be used in the celebration of a wedding. What happened was they had run out of wine, which is a big no-no in the time. And so Jesus actually comes to the rescue after being asked by his mother to do that. And it kind of shows a couple of things. It shows that Jesus has this power over nature. It also shows that God and Jesus love to celebrate along with us and love to see our happiness. As we move on, we're going to talk about the calming of the storm. So here, Jesus and his disciples get in a boat to go across the Lake Gennesaret, but a storm comes up. This doesn't bother Jesus at all. He's taking a nap in the boat, but the disciples are super duper worried. They think that they're going to drown, and that's saying something for these guys who are fishermen who have probably lived their entire lives on the sea. Jesus rises, he rebukes the storm, and he shows his power over nature. After that, we get into the feeding of the 5,000. In the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus and his disciples spend a long day teaching, and people get hungry. So Jesus tells his disciples to go and find food for this crowd. Now, we call it the feeding of the 5,000, but it's actually more like probably 10,000 or maybe even more. They're just counting the men when they count that 5,000. So there's probably women there, there's probably children there, and they're able to feed them all with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. That Jesus makes this small amount stretch over that many people is truly a miracle. So then after that, we get walking on water. And so when we get into this story about Jesus walking on water, Jesus goes by himself in order to pray, but then he seeks to catch up with the disciples. He does that not by hiring himself a boat, but he actually does that by walking on the water. He overtakes them, and they see him, and they're afraid. They think that it's a ghost, because who else would be walking on the water, I guess. But then after they kind of figure out, oh, it's Jesus, Peter does this interesting thing where he says, oh, Lord, let me come out there with you. And Jesus accepts. He says, okay, Peter, come on out. Peter starts walking out there, but he gets worried. He starts to get afraid of the wind and the waves, and he starts to sink. And Jesus has to come in and rescue him. This shows us that Jesus wants us to be like him, wants us to do the things that he is able to do. He gives us the ability to do that, but oftentimes our lack of faith means that we start to falter, and he needs to come in and rescue us again. So that was the miracles. Now let's move on to Jesus and people. We've got a few more stories in this one. So we've got the paralyzed man, Jairus, and the woman with the bleeding, 10 lepers, children, and Zacchaeus. He's going to show us quite a bit about who he is and how he responds to people here. So the first story is the story of the paralyzed man. A group of friends take their paralyzed friend in order to receive healing from Jesus, because obviously he's paralyzed, he can't do that himself. So it's impossible for them to get inside. The room is just packed where Jesus is, and they find a way through the roof. And so they lower him down, and Jesus goes about healing this guy. But he uses it as a time to show that he is really God. So the first thing that he says to the paralyzed man is, your sins are forgiven, not you're well, go and do something. But he says that, and it catches the attention of many of the religious people in the room who say, only God can forgive sins. And Jesus says, yeah, which one is easier, for me to say that I'm forgiving sins, or for me to say that this man should get up and walk? And so obviously it's easier for him to say he forgives sins if that's not a reality. But Jesus combines it with the reality of telling this man to get up and walk, saying, now you see him walk, you also have to believe the other thing that I told him, that he's forgiven, is true as well. So after that, we get into actually 2 stories. It's the story of Jairus' daughter and the bleeding woman. These stories are kind of sandwiched together in the Gospels because they sort of have the same point. They have the same point that Jesus is able to heal people that nobody else is able to heal. So Jairus comes to Jesus and says, my daughter is sick, she's about to die, and please come and heal her. And then Jesus is on the way, and a woman who has been bleeding for many, many years reaches out and touches him, and simply in that act of faith, she receives healing. And this is something that she's been looking for healing for a long time. After that, then, Jesus continues on his way to see Jairus. He finds out that the daughter has been declared dead, but Jesus says, that's not a problem for me. I'm going to tell her to get up. And he just says, well, she's just sleeping. And so he works with both of these people that everybody else has given up on. And yet Jesus is able to provide a way in the midst of all of that. Next, we talk about the 10 lepers, people also that other people have given up on. These 10 lepers are people that would have to be segregated away from the rest of their family and the rest of society. They come up to Jesus to be healed. Jesus tells them to go and see the priest, who is the only person who can officially say that their leprosy is gone. As they go, they see that they're being healed, and still only one guy comes back to give thanks. This guy coming back to give thanks specifically gives thanks in a way that shows us that he understands that Jesus is God, that only God could heal him from his leprosy, and so he's coming back in order to give thanks to God. Next, we talk about Jesus and the children. Jesus is welcoming children in a culture that doesn't see them as very important. Sometimes I think we can think that we don't feel like children are that important, but back then, children were very, very not important. And so the disciples were turning them away, and yet Jesus says that his disciples should humble themselves just as children are humble. Something that Jesus himself then would do on the cross, humbling himself in front of all of us on the cross in order to show us how important we are. Finally, we get to the story of Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is a person who would have been considered a traitor, an enemy to God's people in Israel. He was the chief of the tax collectors, and he is somebody who everybody in Jerusalem, everybody in Israel likely would have regarded with some hatred or at least some disregard. And yet Jesus notices him and says, I'm coming to your house. I want to have dinner with you. This is scandalous for Jesus to do this, and yet it's a great honor for Zacchaeus. And it's a moment in which Zacchaeus actually, in that moment, says, okay, I'm going to change my life. I'm going to do things where now I'm going to repay anyone that I've cheated 4 times over. I'm going to make sure that I'm doing things in a new light. And so those are the stories about Jesus and the beginning of his public ministry. Next time we're going to talk about the parables of Jesus, and then after that we're going to get into the other public part of Jesus's life, which was his suffering and death, and all of those stories that we call the Passion. So parables, Passion, and then we'll get into the resurrection and the life of the church, and after that we're done with these 100 Bible stories. So stay tuned, and we look forward to doing another one of these with you soon.